Welcome to this resin wave tutorial. My name's Michelle Tracy. I'll start by priming my board with a clear gesso. It will dry clear, and this is to prevent any tiny bubbles escaping from the timber into my resin. I've mixed and stirred my art resin for 10 minutes. Yes, 10 minutes. It's winter, so I needed to stir it longer than the usual 3 to 5 minutes. It's important to make sure it's clear before you pour it. And you can see that clear gesso has dried clear. You can't see it on the board at all. I'm using beautiful pigments from Lorez Expressions today, and this is Frosty Mint, and it's a beautiful opaque soft pastel mint color. And I'll use my stick to drag the pigment up the edge of the cup so I can see what the actual transparency is of it before pouring. And for the darker color, I'm using turquoise green from Lorez Expressions as well. And I actually do want to lighten this a bit, so I'll add some angel white. I can see by scraping it up the edge of my cup that it's darker than what I'd like, so I'll just add a bit of angel white to lighten it. Just be mindful though, when you add white to the pigment, it will make it more opaque. But in this case, I actually want opaque pigments to cover that timber. If you use transparent colors, the color of the timber will show through it, and it will alter the pigment color. Because timber is like a yellowish color, it'll turn blues more greener because yellow and blue make green. Make sense? You can just continue using the knife to spread that pigment, but I'm going to try out the heat gun on it because I want to actually use this as a little experiment and see how those colors go together once the heat's been applied to them, just for future reference. Most of it will be covered up with a second layer anyway because they're opaque colors, so I'm not too worried about how it's looking on this first layer. And I did pour that clear line higher than I would have liked because it always runs down. Because resin's self-leveling, it's going to spread out. So I always have it higher, and then when I put the white on, it's going to drop even further, possibly about 1 centimeter. And this knife is actually clean, so don't worry about it touching my clear. It's one I used last time that's really caked on resin on it, but I'm reusing my tool, so that's why I'm using that one. I'll take this time to just pop at any little bubbles and use that blowtorch to really get in there and pop them. And the white I'm using today is also from Lorez Expressions. It's called Angel White. I had to use this one because I just love the name. Now I've left that to sit for about 10 minutes in the cup to thicken up like I always do. For this style of wave, it needs to be really thick, that white. I want the wave to reach up fairly high, so I'm applying quite a lot of white, a thick line of it, and filling in all those little holes so it's a nice, clean, even white edge. I love to use this heat gun with that compressor nozzle because it can blow a lot of air out of it, and I also can control where it's blowing it. It's not in all directions. And I'm attempting not to remain in the one spot for too long because you could heat your resin up too much and possibly burn it. I'm holding it at an angle so that it's not touching the outer edge of that line because I want that to remain very thick and solid. I'll leave that to dry overnight, and the next day I mix my resin, equal parts of art resin. I love using this because I know my pieces are not going to yellow over time. I did heat it in a warm bath for about 15 minutes before I mixed this because it would have had a lot of bubbles being cold winter. And that lacing from the white is looking really good. The Angel White's pairing with art resin really well. I'm only using one colour for this second wave, and that's the turquoise green because there's only a small area. The clear has covered half of that already. And I will mix the Angel White into it again to get a lighter shade. Still looking on the dark side, so I'm going to add a tiny bit more white. You can't add too much pigment to the resin because it just won't set correctly. So I'm trying to hold some restraint here. And a little does go a long way. Oh, and a little tip is to always remove that little stick from the cup when it's just sitting there. Don't leave it in the cup because all tiny bubbles from the wood can then go into your resin and create even more bubbles in the resin, which we're always trying so hard to avoid. You can see how high up I poured that clear. It's very high because I know it's going to drop down probably 1.5 inches. It always drops down for about 1 inch, and then once I pour the white on, it drops down further about 1 centimeter. I also did sand that board between layers, just on that top area where I've poured the pigment, just so that the resin has something to stick to, a bit of tooth. Otherwise, it may lift off that slick surface over time. I'll make sure that this white is opaque enough so when I look at the stick, you can't see through it. It's opaque, see? And as always, it's been left to sit for about 10 minutes to thicken up. And I'm going to pour quite a fair bit on. This is a thicker line this time because I want that white to blow up to the very top of that board. And because it's so thick, that heat gun is set to a high speed, so there's plenty of air blowing out of it, and it's on about a medium heat. A medium to high. You do want some heat coming out of it because that's what creates that lacing, the heat activating with the resin and the pigments. But you don't want it too hot or stay in the one spot for too long. Like I said, it can burn the resin. And it can take a while for that lacing to appear. It can take, 5 to 10 minutes for it to show up. So don't panic too much if you're not seeing it. Like right about now, there's no lacing. But after I apply that blowtorch to bring out the heat, see how it starts forming? And I'll leave it longer and it will just continue overnight. Well, actually not overnight. I mean, probably for the next hour. So what do you all think about the Angel White for lacing? I think it's worked out pretty well. I mean, look at that. It's beautiful. And as always, leave your questions or feedback in the comments. I love reading them. Thank you so much for watching again. My name's Michelle Tracy.